We're now going to switch over to Dr. Pran Yoganathan. Dr. Pran is a gastroenterologist living and working in Sydney. And he's going to tell us the story of where it all went wrong, the tale of modern illness. I think the best thing I can do at the moment is just get out of the way and let Dr. Pran take the stage. Thank you very much.
Hi there, guys. Am I audible there? Okay. All right, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Liz. So, as you said, I'm a gastroenterologist and a hepatologist, and I wanted to talk briefly today on where it went all wrong, where it went wrong in terms of our dietary paradigms. So I've always believed in the philosophy that nothing in biology makes sense unless you view it through the lenses of evolution. And this is a Darwin finch from the Galapagos, and this is where the concept of evolutionary science was born. So I think it's important to take into account that the birth of our species started probably about 4 million years ago, and driven by climate change, in particular what occurred in Africa. So Africa 4 million years ago is a dense, lush rainforest, not dissimilar to what we see in the Amazon today. And the primates that existed there, a monkey-like creature existed there on vegetation and fruits. But as climatic shifts occurred and these rainforests gave way to savannas as seen below, what we saw was a change in the food structure or what was available for this creature. So in essence, what occurred was that these creatures basically had to adapt to be able to evolve and survive. So some of the reasons for the rapid expansion of the human brain is thought to be scavenging energy-rich bone marrow, which we think occurred with a creature called Afarensis, what we know as the fossil remains of a female known as Lucy. So these creatures learned to unlock the energy-rich bone marrow, and what they had in return was saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat, which this was rich in. In addition, as we progressed through the evolutionary phase, in particular with Homo erectus, which was the first hunting Homo species, we had the hunting of megafauna, which were very rich in fat, which of course is energy, which our brain, which is an energy-rich or energy-hungry organ, requires. At some point, coastal foraging, which started in the southernmost tips of Africa, was also very important in allowing for continuous brain growth due to the energy-rich nature of the seafood. Now, the agricultural revolution with grains and crops, in fact, did not contribute to our brain expansion, as I'll touch on later, may actually have hindered it. So just a few details about the nature of the human species, in particular in relation to the gastrointestinal tract, which obviously is my area of interest. The pH of the human stomach is extremely acidic. I've said the pH is 1.5, but it can drop to as low as 1 and even sub 1 in some members of our species. What's interesting is a bacteria that we coexist with, probably a form of symbiosis, something called Helicobacter pylori, which you guys might be aware of. It's very, very popular in the primary care sector, makes our stomachs more acidic still. And unfortunately, it's out of place now with this modern environment as the levels of acidity are not used. Now, what's interesting is when you compare the pH of our primate cousins, they tend to be very high, 4s to 6s, which is starting to approach neutrality. So it's quite evident that the way we're wired from a gastrointestinal perspective is for high risk food, very similar to the birds of carrion like vultures and owls. when you're eating high-risk foods, it is important that you've got an extremely acidic stomach to detoxify, or essentially to kill these contaminated meats. And it's clear that we spent a lot of our evolutionary history as a scavenger, which is what most anthropologists agree on as well. So what I believe Homo sapiens, which is the modern humans, are, we are essentially a primate built for nutrient density. This is very telling when you look at, when you break down the gut length in terms of species. So you've got the monkeys and the chimps and the gibbons and so forth versus us. And you can see here, circled in red, our small bowel length in comparison to our primate cousins is enormous. So what we're built for is essentially nutrient density. This is where energy-rich foods tend to get digested and absorbed through enzymatic digestion. And when you're breaking down protein, something called putrefactive digestion. Now, compare it to the colon, and this is again very telling. Our colonic lengths really are quite short compared to our primate cousins. Now, the colon is where you do something called a fermentative method of digestion, which is where you ferment non-digestible carbohydrates that you've not been able to absorb in the small bowel, and additionally fiber. What you do with that is you ferment these things to try and extract a fat known as butyrate, which is a ketone. So in essence, our primate cousins are basically utilizing fiber to ferment for fat. It is quite clear we're very different. We are built to eat the fat directly. Now, this is something called the expensive tissue hypothesis, which again is well understood in anthropology, which is that essentially we've got an expensive tissue that we carry that our primate cousins don't, and that's the brain. It's an extremely energy hungry organ, and to allow the brain expansion, our gut needed to become extremely simplistic. Fermentation is not a simplistic process. It's a very energy expensive process. So what we learned to do was we learned to hunt, we learned to forage, we learned to scavenge in order to allow our large intestine to shrink, which basically unlocked energy to be transferred to the brain. In addition, when you're eating nutrient density or energy density, you have a situation whereby the gut can be fairly simplistic, as opposed to our ruminant, the ruminant creatures such as the cows and so forth. They tend to have a very complex digestive tract, you know, with stomachs that require multiple changes. All of that is being lost in humankind. So in essence, what I'm trying to say is we are essentially hunters. We became apex predators, but somewhere along the lines, we lost our way. Now, we can look at these hunter-gatherer groups that exist primarily in Southern America and in the Amazon and also in Africa, but these groups, whilst they're not exactly gentrified, that they are certainly not the same species of human that existed pre-agriculture. The impact of modernization has certainly impacted them to a point where their hunting is relatively limited. But looking into their lives gives us some insight as to how valued protein used to be. So agriculture was an interesting phenomenon. We're not exactly sure where it started, but somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, in what is probably modern day Iran. There are some reports that it might have started in Göbekli Tepe, which is absolutely an amazing structure, which is buried deep beneath the hills in Turkey, which is close to 12 to 13,000 years old. It's quite evident there were aspects of agriculture starting to emerge in this modern day, in this emerging concept of civilization, as we went from these nomadic hunters to a settled species of creature which could build a civilization. So it was important that agriculture came along for us to settle, for us to be able to build civilization. But when you look at it, when you zoom out and take a look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it's quite evident that for 3 to 4 million years, we've existed with this diet, which is very different to what we see today. Now, as grains kicked in about 9,000 years ago, we started to change biologically. But in the last 50 to 60 years, we've got industry, we've got agriculture, we've got pesticides, we've got hormones, we've got mechanization. More recently, we've got globalization, we've got foods out of season and significant genetic manipulation, which is problematic. And of course, more recently, we've got chemical manipulation of food, and we've got hyperpalatability, which has been selected for by industry. And we've got separation of forest and farm as well. All very problematic, all very sudden when you compare our history. So it's quite evident, looking through the literature and just through the fossil records, that we've certainly deteriorated in terms of our physicality. So there are several studies from a variety of regions that suggest that there's been a decline in our skeletal robustness, stature, as we transitioned from a hunting-gathering society to an agricultural dependence. With agriculture came a massive change in the human diet, which caused our lower jaws to shrink. We've got crowded teeth now because we simply do not have enough space in our jaws as they shrunk. We also find very interesting traits such as depigmentation. 5,000 years ago in Europe, every European looked the way this man does. This is the cheddar man, which through DNA sequencing, it's quite evident that the early Europeans, even as far back as 5,000 years ago, were dark-skinned. Now, as they dark-skinned and had blue eyes, a lot of them now, those two traits are thought to developed independently of each other. But it's quite clear about 5,000 years ago, we start switching off the melatonin gene. The melatonin gene gives us color and pigmentation in our skin. The reason for this is, as agriculture was starting to take hold in Europe, the vitamin D content in our diet was dropping. In particular, the intake of things like organ meats, which would have made a big part of a Paleolithic man's diet, a man or woman's diet, was certainly diminishing. So as vitamin D started shrinking in the diet, it's quite evident that we had to learn to make it in our skin. And given the Northern European climates, which are not as sun-rich as the Australian climates, obviously, these people had to depigment to be able to learn to make vitamin D in their skin, which is a very, very fascinating mutation. Now, it's also quite evident 30,000 years ago, these humans were about 6 inches taller than the descendants who lived in the era of agriculture, just stronger, just more robust. And you look through the fossil records in terms of cranial capacity, that has shrunk quite significantly, about 180 cc, which is, we've lost brain volume over the agricultural revolution, which to me makes sense when you look at the understanding of astronomy and science and the ability to build some of these mega structures that they were able to. I mean, it's quite clear that their functioning must have been quite high. So modern chronic illness, the way I define, is the tale of how we became removed from the acquisition of our food supply. It's quite clear that we no longer risk our life for food, which in a way is a positive thing, but we are very much still a Stone Age body trapped in a Space Age food environment. So early agriculture certainly altered our portion size, and our perspective now is that these foods have always existed. A carrot always was a carrot, but the reality is that a carrot was simply a root, a non-nutritious root, which perhaps provided some starch, some phytonutrients, but you can see we've selected for taste, we've selected for looks. This is the modern era, and all of this very quickly, this has happened over a few hundred years. So even a few thousand years ago, a carrot still looked very similar to the way it looks now. But we got smarter about how we genetically manipulate things. It also altered our perspective on portion size. You have to look at the modern day potato versus the wild potato that we see now. It almost reflects the human shape if you look at it, because we've essentially selected for energy density and taste and portions. It's important to realize that these vegetables that we see here on the right-hand side, the broccolis, the cabbages, the kales, the turnips, the cauliflowers, kales simply did not exist. They were a non-nutritious weed known as the brassica, which we, through human ingenuity, have simply bred into something that is palatable and more phytonutrient rich. But these things did not exist 9 to 10,000 years ago, even a few thousand years ago. We were very dependent on animal-based foods. We've done the same with fruits, and what we've done in exchange is that we've bred out the nutrients. The phytonutrient content of fruit is bred out. So we've essentially got a carbohydrate to nutrient ratio, which is very high. Elevated carbohydrate content versus a nutrient content which is significantly diminished. Now you look at these small Sikkim apples or crab apples, you look at this on the left-hand side of the table, which shows the phytonutrient content, which is about 7,000 per milligrams per litre of juice, versus the modern day apples like the Granny Smith, the Fuji, the Red Delicious, very, very phytonutrient depleted. So fruit is not the same. This little crab apple's something from my backyard, and it really gives you some perspective. It does not taste like our modern apple does. Same thing we've done with peach, which was developed sometime, some 100 years ago, a few thousand years ago in China. Very similar to the avocado, which is a Central American fruit, which we've just bred again for taste, looks, and size. So what we're doing here is we're just selecting for energy rather than nutrients. The Paleolithic period, of course, was a very difficult time. There was a climactic shift called the Younger Dryas, which is thought to have been a cosmic strike from above in Greenland, which essentially plunged humankind into a 1,000-year winter. And so as animals died with these climactic shifts, I think humans were reduced to experimenting with eating grass. And this is the birth of wheat, barley, and corn. And this is the birth of agriculture. We had to do it. We had to adapt. And that's what makes us remarkable as humans. We're highly adaptable. Now, this is a striking photograph of our Australian Aboriginal, which shows this elderly man in his 60s in the middle and his two sons. Now, that is a striking photo to me, because this man simply hasn't lost muscle density. And you compare him to the younger men to his left and right, his muscle density still remains, because simply he's utilizing it. He's utilizing it with movement and utilizing it with a diet that is very rich in protein. The Aboriginals are thought to have eaten up to 250 grams of protein, 190 from animal protein, 60 from plant protein, and they needed it for the levels of exertion. Now, as we know, this population has been plunged into a diabetic epidemic amongst these groups. But there was a brilliant study done in the 80s by a chap called O'Dear, which showed just a simple reversion back to their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, just for an 8-week period, reversed their diabetes, which is quite striking. Same thing in India. I mean, India is now one of the most populous countries in the world, and I think 30 to 40% of India are vegetarian, but they've got a diabetes epidemic like you wouldn't believe. I mean, we think in Australia we've got issues. China and India have got a massive issue on their hands. Now, people look back at the traditional subcontinental diet and say, well, look, we've always been vegetarians, but that is not correct. There are tribes that still exist in the remote forests in India that live very similarly to the way that they used to live, and these are the Vedda people, and these people are hunter-gatherers, a very, very dense diet in terms of their meat content. So that slide suggests that meat causes obesity and type 2 diabetes, because these people, the true subcontinental people of that region, have a very heavy consumption of meat, and you can see that they remain lean and probably metabolically fit. It's interesting to note that the Australian Aboriginals are thought to have originated in that region and crossed the land bridge about 40 to 60,000 years ago. Very similar people, very similar in terms of their carbohydrate intolerance, become very diabetic very quickly in response to diet. But we say that the lifespan of a hunter-gatherer is short. They don't live for very long. And this is true. The average age is very short. It's about 30 to 40, but it's important to acknowledge that this does not take into account that 40% of them are dead before the age of 15, simply through very harsh lives. In particular, the journey through the birth canal is very, very tricky for them, and a lot of them die during childbirth, including the mother. So this skews average age. In addition, a lot of these children die from the fact that they get enteric illnesses, horrible enteric illnesses, that they essentially die of diarrhea, which is a common enteric illness. Now, what's interesting to note is those that make it to the age of 15, they will live to 70 to 80 years of age. Beyond that, so a lot of them do live to that age without any medical intervention and remain fit, and they die at 70 or 80 70 or 80 years of age, not of heart disease, not of Alzheimer's, not of metabolic illness, they die of infection, again, enteric infection. It's quite evident that the immune system is weakest at its youngest and its oldest, but they do not die the way we die in our West. So that average age argument can be put to bed very, very quickly. So this is my perspective of where we're heading. This is the health of the population, which is terrible. The healthcare sector, which remains relatively calm at the moment, but on the trajectory is a tsunami that I don't think we can even begin to fathom. As we've seen these obesity rates amongst children soar, these people will make very sick adults, and I think we're in a world of trouble. So where did it all start? I mean, where did this dietary shift occur? And this is thought to have occurred as President Eisenhower many decades ago suffered a heart attack, and really ischemic heart disease or heart disease was starting to become more prevalent in America or in the West. Henceforth, essentially a task force was put in place to find out, well, what causes it. Step in a man called Ancel Keys, a nutritionist, a very prominent figure in that time. And basically, he published what was called a 7-country study, which looked at the percentage of dietary calories from fat versus heart deaths. And what he noted was that the lowest percentage of fat intake, countries like Japan and Italy, had the lowest heart rate deaths, versus these countries like Australia, the US, Canada, and England, very, very high. So he was able to plot a beautiful graph that showed if your fat content was high, well, your risk of heart disease was higher. But in reality, this was a 22-country study, and a lot of these Scandinavian countries where huge percentage of their diet came from fat, he left off. So it's quite evident that he basically cherry-picked the data. And when you look at the graph of the 22 countries, it's just essentially there is no correlation between dietary fat and heart death per population. There's clearly another factor at play. So, I mean, Ancel Keys went on to make the Time magazine, a very, very prominent figure, as I mentioned before, but that study was flawed. Now, the American Heart Association, in the 60s, step in, and essentially they promote the reduction of saturated fat from our diet and increase the intake of polyunsaturated fat, in particular with things like vegetable oils. And you can see there in red, that's soybean oil, which from the 60s to where we see now has increased by something like 2,000%. We know this is a highly inflammatory and very easy to oxidize fat, which our system as humans is simply not adapted to. It's never seen it in the millions of years that we've been evolving for. And vegetable oils at their core, we need to realize that Rudolf Diesel basically designed his first diesel engine to run on vegetable oils. It was at the time diesel was cheaper. Henceforth, they made the decision to run it on that. But I mean, your diesel car can still very easily run on vegetable oils with a few minor tweaks. My perspective here is that something that runs your car simply cannot be something that is human appropriate. Of course, with the American Heart Association stepping in, they were able to use doctors to promote vegetable oils. Very similar to how we've seen in the 30s with cigarettes being promoted by doctors as a healthy and good leisure activity. So they were able to do this through margarine, through vegetable oils, through corn oil, and we saw a massive increase in our trans-saturated and polyunsaturated fat intake and a massive reduction in our saturated fat intake. And so the low-fat dietary guidelines are issued here in the 70s, and we see a massive uptake of sugar consumption and wheat consumption per capita. And of course, the obesity rates soar along with that trajectory. It's quite a telling picture.
When are you having a holiday? You won't be excited because we're taking the bus.
So what we've got here is the food pyramid, which was born in that era by the American Agricultural Society contributing significantly to this, which is the heavy intake of grains, fruits, and vegetables with the demonization of protein up here. And some people may see it like this, a sort of a pie chart almost in school with a very low percentage of protein and a very high percentage
I'll see you out there. What are you doing?
of vegetables, grains, and skim
For
products.
an hour.
So essentially what we've got here,
Work done.
by
I'll be
virtue
doing
of
it
the
Why?
by virtue of fear of saturated fat is essentially protein dilution. We've got a very low percentage of protein making up our diet. And this is a problem because to explain this, I need to touch on something called protein leverage hypothesis, which is why obesity simply does not exist in the wild. Every mammal and even some reptiles are hardwired with a very ancient mechanism that makes us crave or seek out protein to satisfy a requirement. Therefore, obesity will not exist in the wild because these animals are hardwired to search out a protein target, whether it comes from plant or animal food. If they're not able to meet that target, they essentially become malnourished. However, in the modern day, we are protein deprived, but the problem is we now exist with energy-rich foods. Energy is something that we no longer have the activity because of our sedentary lifestyles to burn off. Hence, we store it, it becomes a battery. And this is protein leverage hypothesis, which is a very, very elegant concept to explain the modern day obesity epidemic. So in essence, to simplify it, how it works is that you've got satiety rankings. You've got protein, which is by far the most satiating component of macronutrient in our diet, followed by fat and followed by carbohydrate. Now, fat and carbohydrate are simply energy sources. And as I said, we no longer have the activity levels to be able to utilize this energy. So in the setting of protein deprivation, which we have, we are programmed to seek out energy, which is fat and carbohydrate. And often these new modern day foods are selected for by scientists in their labs that select for hyperpalatability, which is a perfect combination of fat, carbohydrate, and often salt. So this makes it very, very addictive and something that's recognized by the human brain as beautiful to taste. However, it is simply not satisfying and it makes for a very poor diet. So the way the protein leverage hypothesis works when you apply it to the model of obesity is that the current model looks at it, and as a doctor, I must say I've been guilty of it in the past, where I've looked at obesity in the past as simply just gluttony and sloth. But the true model of obesity, the way I understand it now, is that it's simply protein deprivation. Henceforth, people are overeating energy. They are hardwired to do so. It is an ancient reflex inbuilt into our brain, and we simply do not have the activity levels to burn it off. Willpower does not come into this, and this is the issue. The obesity epidemic is made to look like a willpower issue. I don't see it as such. I see it as a failure of the nutritional paradigm. Protein leverage hypothesis simplified. Eat more of this, so you eat less of this. Again, simplified, eat more of this, so you crave less of this. It is not a willpower issue. And it's quite interesting, the percentage of protein in your diet dictates the calories you consume. This was published by a chap called Martin Kelly, and he showed very elegantly, the higher the percentage of protein in your diet, the less calories you end up eating. You are automatically calorie restricting by virtue of the satiety of protein. People say that calories don't matter. That's rubbish. Calories are extremely important. And you know, of course, insulin is an important player, and I'll touch on that. But the reality is we are simply overeating calories because of protein dilution in our diet. I mean, the average Australian sits at about 15 to 20% protein intake. Henceforth, they will always overeat calories. It is not their fault that they do so. But once you start hitting the 30% mark, you can start seeing something remarkable, which is that you start approaching where you should be for your calorie intake. Well, take someone who's 70% protein, their intake of calories is extremely low through the course of the day. Now, what I'm interested in, the people out here, the outliers, perhaps such as myself, who are 90 to 95, maybe even 100% protein, we are automatically calorie restricted by virtue of the nature of the diet. So there is a difference between energy and there is a difference between nutrients. And we must understand this. This here is a glazed donut, 280 calories versus 4 eggs, 280 calories. One is nutrient dense and very, very rich in protein and minerals and vitamin and fats and so forth. Now, what you've got there is simply satiety. You will not be hungry after this, versus this, where you could take in maybe 8 of those donuts and still not feel satisfied, because this is energy dense. Our brain can't sense it. It does not know how to link it to satiety. And this is the problem. Modern day diets are energy dense, nutrient poor. So, I mean, I'll touch on this briefly, but we've got that Mediterranean food pyramid, which I don't know why we still have it up. There are many, many reviews, in particular a Cochrane review that shows that despite all the recommendations to eat a Mediterranean style diet, there are no clinical endpoints in terms of heart disease for primary and secondary prevention. It makes no difference. If you are on a Mediterranean diet, you will not prevent a heart attack. The evidence, in fact, the Cochrane review shows us this is a massive database of medical studies, and quite elegantly done and published last year in 2019. Not many people, well, you know, the health system certainly hasn't recognized it, but it's a very relevant study. And again, there's just so much misconception out there. I mean, we look at olive oil as healthy fat, and 100 grams of lean rump steak is bad fat, but the reality is 1 tablespoon of olive oil contains the so-called bad fat as portrayed by the media, which is saturated fat, versus a lean rump steak. I'm not saying saturated fat is bad. I'm simply pointing out that the science and the numbers shows us what's portrayed is simply doesn't match up with the numbers. Again, fish is portrayed as a good fat versus beef, which is a bad fat. Well, again, 100 grams of mackerel contains more saturated fat than 100 grams of grass-fed beef, which tends to be lower in energy, higher in nutrients. So just to touch on diabetes very quickly, our current remission rate with standard medical care is woeful. It's laughable. It's 0.23%. It's clear that the status quo will not reverse the health crisis. This will continue to build. Insulin, well, insulin at its core is simply a storage hormone. And I'm sure you've seen these type of graphs, but the insulin response to carbohydrate is enormous. Insulin response to protein is high, and the insulin response to fat is very low. So if you look at insulin as simply a storage, a hormone that promotes storage and switches off fat burning, well, carbohydrates stimulate insulin. And right at that bottom of that food pyramid with all the foods that we're promoted to eat, well, that's all carbohydrates, including the grains, the breads, the fruits, and the vegetables. And type 2 diabetes is a disease of too much insulin. So in essence, we've been preparing for a winter or a famine that never comes. We never get to utilize the fat, unlike the bear, which hibernates for months. I mean, we're capable of doing that. I mean, this gentleman, theoretically, and these sort of studies have been studied in the 40s and 50s before, where someone with enough body fat can simply survive on water, survive for many, many months. Angus Barberry proved it, where he fasted for 8 to 12 months. He was a very heavy chap, very similar to the gentleman shown here, and essentially survived on water and salt with 0 calories in his diet, and lost a lot of weight consequently, not surprisingly. So diabetes, metabolic syndrome, is simply a carbohydrate intolerant state. So I do not understand why the diet of someone with this condition contains carbohydrates. Historically, in John Hopkins in the 1800s, they prescribed a diet for type 1 diabetics, which is essentially a very high fat diet. 65% fat, 32% protein, and a very, very low carbohydrate content. Now, as insulin became commercialized, of course, these people went back to normal diets, and we've got a problem there, as we know. In addition, we shy away from saturated fat because, well, it pushes up your LDL. But the idea that high cholesterol in the blood, the main causes of heart disease, is impossible, because low-level LDL levels still contribute to heart disease. In fact, 85% of people that present, 80 to 85% of people that present with heart attacks have a normal LDL level. So the fact that we think that LDL is causative is simply rubbish. And I think it's based on very, very poor data. I'm sure you guys have seen this. This is from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is their latest recommendations. Just to summarize it, just a few weeks ago this was published. They said there is no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fat. There is, in fact, protective effects of saturated fat, in particular in preventing things like hemorrhagic stroke. It is not associated with increased risk of heart disease, and the evidence does not support limiting its intake, which is, I think, a victory for the low carb followers. So, I mean, just my personal perspective, and this is a photo of myself. I'm quite lean at the moment with my diet, and this is well, it's not an actual patient, but a 40-year-old gentleman. I've just pulled that photo from the internet at a very, very high body fat percentage. We're both subcontinental males, and I'm just going to show to you that the total cholesterol is a meaningless measure. He's a vegetarian, typical subcontinental diet, very, very rich in carbohydrate. His diet's probably 80 to 90% carbohydrate versus my diet, which is almost completely devoid of carbohydrate, which is very heavy in meat and eggs and this sort of thing. Now, that's my serum there. Shows a very clear return, very low triglyceride content, probably. Now, I'll touch on his insulin first. And you can see the insulin of this gentleman is 25. So he's actually, well, to be quite honest, he's diabetic with his sugars of 9.5. But his insulin shows that he's simply fasting. He's simply stimulating this constantly with the diet, which is very, very nutrient poor. And because of the protein content lacking, this man will eat through the whole day. He will snack and pick on things, and his insulin is constantly stimulated versus someone like myself who is extremely insulin sensitive, as will most low-carb individuals be. You can see there that the testosterone on this gentleman is very low. He's starting to decline, head towards the lower levels, whereas my testosterone is very high. I hypothesize, I've never been able to find anything in the literature, but I think it's important for testosterone to be pushed. I think you need cholesterol to be able to build these sex hormones, and simply if he lacks the substrate, well, you won't be able to build this. And testosterone is important simply because it helps you for many factors, but it helps you retain lean muscle mass, which obviously helps you maintain your basal metabolic rate. Now, the cholesterol tests are quite telling. I mean, that's him on the left with his cholesterol of 5, and my total cholesterol is almost double his. Now, most primary care physicians and actually almost all cardiologists would look at this figure and say, well, I should be medicated or change my diet, whereas he gets given the tick as a clean bill of health. But the reality of the situation, this man is diabetic, extremely metabolically unwell, and essentially suffering sarcopenic obesity, under muscle and over fat. Now, this hopefully should be well understood in the low carb world, but these lipid subfractions prove that despite his low cholesterol, he'll spit out something called a type B pattern because of his small, dense LDL patterns, which are very, very high. He lacks in the buoyant, large LDL 1 and 2 molecules, which are things that I think drive immunity, drive testosterone and estrogen production. I think they probably drive good brain health as well. Versus my results, which you can see are primarily the large buoyant type, which spits out a type A pattern. There's a reason why his is highlighted in red, because the laboratories, Douglas Hanley Moyer laboratories that do this test recognize this as a high-risk pattern and mine as a low-risk pattern. So the question is, why doesn't medicine, why doesn't the healthcare sector see this? So it is important to realize that there are 7 species of cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, LDL 1 through to LDL 7. LDL 1 and 2, again, I'll repeat, are beneficial. LDL 3 to 7 are problematic. These are the small, dense, oxidized particles which tend to accumulate in the intima of our arteries, do drive atherosclerosis. So when you hear people in the low carb world say, well, LDL is not a problem, well, that's not factual. LDL is a big problem. It is a massive problem, but it's the oxidized LDL that is an issue. I've seen people with cholesterols as low as 2.5 or 2 who've got a type B pattern, which is a high-risk pattern, which again goes to show total cholesterol is meaningless. So my summary is, I think one has to be the leanest, most muscular, insulin-sensitive version of yourself. I think we've got to forget the dietary dogma and eat a human-specific diet that provides satiety, which for me is a very heavy, high-protein diet. I think protein is satiety. I think prioritize protein at every meal. I do feel vegetables are overrated, especially in this modern environment in which we exist. The phytonutrient content of vegetables, as atmospheric CO2 rises and the soil health declines, the phytonutrient content drops. These vegetables are no longer the vegetables that we had 50 to 60 years ago, the carbohydrate to nutrient ratio on these vegetables is extremely high. They look like a vegetable. They taste like a vegetable, although their nutrient content has declined significantly. Fruits, I think, I do believe, are overrated. It's not that they're bad. I simply think that energy, like fruit, has to be earned. And cereals and grains, well, I certainly believe those are overrated. And nutritional guidelines, for lack of a better word, are BS. I do believe that they've led us to an obesity epidemic. But I think hopefully we can claw our way out of this, although I'm not entirely hopeful. And we've seen this, the upside down pyramid is the way to do it, minus the sweets at the top of the pyramid. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
Well, thanks, Pran. That was amazing. We were actually all cheering here when we saw your total cholesterol score, because that seems to be a massive topic on everybody's mind when most of us are in clinic with people, is what about the cholesterol? So there was a lot of cheering in this room when we saw your blood panel. So thanks for sharing that.
No problem, Tracy. I mean, it's quite clear that I'm a hyper responder, and there are some people that will respond like this. And I've seen LDLs close to 10, total cholesterol is close to 18, and these are very lean, healthy people. So, I mean, we've got to keep that in mind, I think, in primary care, and certainly from a cardiology perspective as well.
Absolutely. One of the things I look at is what is the person's HbA1c, what's their fasting insulin, do they look like they have active metabolic syndrome? I recently spoke to a medical specialist who said, oh, your cholesterol's a bit high, and quick as a flash I said, yeah, but look at my HDL and my triglycerides. My HDL's not quite as magnificent as yours, but it's pretty good. And triglycerides are right low. That shut him right up.
Yeah. Well, we've got the pyramid. We've got a triangle. We've got the atherogenic dyslipidemia. At the tip of the triangle is a high triglyceride. Then it's a oxidized LDL and a low HDL.
HDL, yeah, absolutely.
There was a question that came through. How do you know if you have oxidized LDL?
Yeah, so this is the $150 test. Probably Liz is the best one to talk about it, but this is a $150 test that unfortunately Medicare I don't think covers, and you have to pay out of pocket. But it's essentially break down the LDL subfraction, know what your HDL is. You want a high HDL, and what I tend to see is those with an LDL 1 and 2 that's elevated tend to automatically have an elevated HDL. So the LDL subfraction is very, very important because it'll essentially tell you that you've got an oxidized or a non-oxidized pattern.
Who should be getting these tests?
I tend to offer it where people have elevated LDL and there's some question about whether it might be the oxidized, an atherogenic picture or a non-atherogenic picture. And I might do it also to provide that patient with information. Like one lady came in obsessed about her high LDL, and she of course had this perfect healthy diet, ate lots of whole grains and legumes and vegetables, and but didn't want to go on statins. And I basically talked her into doing a low carbohydrate, healthy fat diet. And we showed by monitoring that it took her profile from intermediate to a profile A. And she wasn't very happy about the idea of healthy fats. The idea of healthy fats horrified her. But the testing actually did prove that you can shift your LDL subfraction profile by changing your diet. She actually did do what I asked her to, and we proved that it shifted her profile back to profile A. Another question that came through was, what level of protein do you recommend in grams per kilogram generally? What's your protein intake, and what do you recommend to patients?
Sure, Liz. I mean, it's a good questions, and you see it in the literature. The elderly promoted to have a protein intake of 2 grams per kilogram, which for them is almost impossible because the anorexia of aging kicks in, poor dentition, just lack of motivation. Often depression tends to exist in these elderly populations, under-recognized, and they simply don't have the motivation to get in that much protein. And we're talking 150, 160 grams of protein, which is my target. I'm relatively active, you know, just physically. So I try and keep my protein intake at close to 1.8, 1.6 to 1.8. But the reality of the situation is with a high protein diet, you kind of just auto-regulate. You just eat when you're hungry, and just prioritize protein at every meal. And this is what I try and do. Sometimes I do have to push myself, and that's how difficult and satiating protein is. And I've posted on this before. A high protein diet really takes away that hedonistic appeal of food. I think personally, from a personal perspective, you know, some people might say it's sad, but I've lost the concept as food is pleasure, and I simply look at it as a fuel source. I enjoy it, meat and fish and this sort of thing, but it is simply just become a fuel, which I think a lot of people on high protein diets tend to do automatically. And there's a lot of literature on this. It essentially rewires your neural circuits.
You're not relying on the dopamine hits.
No, not at all. Not at all, Liz. But look, I acknowledge I'm probably a type A personality and very routine-driven type of individual. And it may not work for everyone, but I think if all of us, and in particular for our elderly population, I think we should be advising them to prioritize protein at every meal. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, like if you're on a ketogenic diet for therapeutic reasons such as epilepsy and other neurological conditions like migraines and so forth, that's a different story because the high protein diet will generally kick you out of a high level ketosis. But what I tend to find is on a diet such as mine, which is very protein heavy, I never chase ketones, automatically I'll flick into nutritional ketosis after exercise or after a period of not eating for a few hours with a low level ketosis about 0.3 to 0.5. To be honest, I think moving forward, I'd love to see some future research on it. This is where the money might be. I think a low level nutritional ketosis, which allows you to utilize ketones efficiently, is the way to do it. As I see a lot of attrition on the ketogenic diets because people are constantly chasing these high ketones, and when they can't reach it, they get very disheartened and give up. Well, she had a ketone level of 0.8 and 1.8, and I can only get it up to 0.5. It just means with a low level ketosis, your body's utilizing those ketones very well and you're metabolically flexible.
Yeah, correct. That's what I try to work on with a lot of people is not chasing those figures with the ketones. There are some people that may need to have them, like you said, for neurological disorders and things like that, because we obviously know that we need them. But I like to be able to get people, especially when I'm working with them, to be able to get them into ketosis so we know that they can get there. But I honestly believe our bodies should be able to be going to the dual fuel sources as we need them, as we move about. And that's what I say to a lot of the people that I work with is let's stop chasing the numbers. Let's let your body work and be metabolically flexible, because I think that's far more important.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Okay, there's actually lots more I'm sure that we could talk about, and it's now past 4 o'clock and we've been going 2 days solid. We're going to wrap up with a panel on creating change, but before we do, the couple of us that are gathered in the room, we're going to give Dr. Pran a great big round of applause. Thank you very much for your time and your generosity and sharing. Would you like to stay on part of the panel?
Yeah, sure. I've got some time. Yeah.